Life Management Science Labs would like to acknowledge that we live and produce this podcast on the traditional lands of the Wurundjeri people. We'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands of our listeners and our international colleagues. We'd like to pay our respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Doing Well, the Wellbeing Science Insights podcast produced by LMSL, the Life Management Science Labs. We're champions of life management science, providing structured insights informed by science and inspired by practice on key aspects of conscious living. Each week, we bring you scientific and practical insights on each element with the expert knowledge of professionals in the field. I'm your host, Lu Ngo, coming to your ears from Naarm, Melbourne, Australia. Let's learn together. Hi, everyone, and welcome back to Doing Well. And on this week's episode, we are going to talk about the power of purpose, enhancing well-being through your why. If you are tuning into the show, chances are you are really into personal development. And, this is nothing new, but we are going to discover it from a more scientific perspective. And we're going to talk a little bit about character strengths, which I find to be very interesting. And today we have our wonderful guest who is, as she sort of talked about herself, a professor who can talk about this topic quite a bit. And I'm going to introduce her and get her to share a bit more about herself. So, welcome to the show, Kendall. Here we have Kendall Cotton Bronk, Ph.D., who is the principal investigator for the Adolescent Moral Development Lab and a professor of psychology in the Division of Behavioral and Social Sciences at the Claremont Graduate University. She is a developmental scientist interested in studying and promoting positive youth development and the moral growth of young people. Morning brain. Most commonly, she has investigated these topics through the lens of young people's purposes in life. Welcome to the show, and thank you for being here, Kendall.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Yeah, well, I think it's particularly interesting that you work with young people because I think young people and purpose in life, these two are, supposed to go hand in hand. But I think there's been such a lack of, that area. And I know that for a fact because, I'm not that far off from those days when I was a young person trying to figure out what I want to do with my life. And there was really no question about what is your purpose. There was a lot of questions about, okay, what do you want to do in the future? And that's it. There was no connection there with, a sense of purpose in life. And so for today, hopefully we are going to touch on how we can help young people go about understanding how this can be built into our lives earlier on. And, maybe we can pay it forward in many ways. But before we get into that, bit of the conversation, I'm curious because obviously this topic is quite niche and working with young people particularly, there's got to be a reason behind that. So I wonder why you chose this line of work and, what really drives you to sort of show up at work every day.
Yeah, thanks for the question. I love studying purpose. I find it to be a really inspiring topic of study. So we're when we're doing research, we're sitting down often with young people and interviewing them for up to an hour, asking them, what really motivates you? What gets you going in the morning? What do you hope to accomplish in your life? And I tell you what, every single time I do an interview, I come away so inspired and so hopeful for the future. Because young people, it turns out, have some really interesting ideas about how they want to contribute to the broader world, how they want to give back. And so I think for all of those reasons, I've really enjoyed studying purpose across the lifespan, but particularly with young people.
Yeah, definitely. Well, I think that the sense of purpose it's not something that is static either. It's kind of something that will evolve as we go through our lives. But being able to ask that question to young people, I think, is particularly important, especially because nowadays there's just such a strong emphasis on, like you have to do this, you have to do that. But there's no question about, so what do you want to do? There's that emphasis that I think we can find out a bit more today. And I'm interested in finding out about what you have learned through your research, having worked with so many people, especially young people. Before we get into that part, let's talk about you a bit more. We have a section where we call it Have You Met Kendall? We are going to get to know you through some of your favorite things. The first thing that I would love to ask is about a book. What is your favorite book?
Yes, good question. Well, I have to admit, I love to read. I'm a very avid reader. So gosh, I almost feel like it's pretty hard to pick just one favorite book. When I think about nonfiction, I have to say one of the most impactful books I've ever read is Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning, which is if you're interested in this topic of purpose, highly recommend reading it. Viktor Frankl was probably the first person to think about the role of purpose in human well-being. And even though he didn't do a lot of empirical research on the topic, his intuitions are spot on. And the book is just super inspiring. I also love just good old fiction books. I guess I really enjoy historical fiction. So I've read a lot of books, World War II kinds of books, All the Light We Cannot See, right? The Book Thief. I just finished Lessons in Chemistry, which I guess is now a Netflix special. So I look forward to watching that on Netflix. So I love to read, and I read a really broad variety of books.
Yeah, that's really cool. Thank you for sharing that. Yeah, I've been seeing Lessons in Chemistry everywhere, especially on my Apple TV suggestions. It's just kind of like there. I'm like, oh, okay, now that's just interesting. I didn't know that was a historical fiction. Okay, now.
That one is a historical fiction. It's about a woman who is really interested in science. So, it's one of those things that didn't actually happen, but it kind of could have.
Yeah, okay, that's really cool. So that leads me to the next question, because you sort of mentioned, TV and, like theater. And if that's the case, let's talk about a movie. If you have been, watching movies lately, what would be one that sort of really stood out to you?
Gosh, again, hard to pick one. I do love, I love all different kinds of movies as well. So comedies, gosh, just the other night, I think we watched La La Land, which for someone who lives in Southern California is always fun. I also like movies with a little more of a message, Hacksaw Ridge, King's Speech. I really got into Ted Lasso. No, it's not a movie, it's a TV show. But I thought that he was such a fun and upbeat and hopeful and kind character. And as someone who studies moral development, I've often thought he's a bit of a moral exemplar. And his story to be pretty inspiring too.
Oh, that's really cool. Yeah, my friend told me about Ted Lasso as well, and I was like, oh, okay, didn't think about that. But yeah, I have been seeing that on my recommendation list too. So thank you for sharing a bunch of recommendations there. I love that. Now, I don't know if you are a podcast listener. Lots of people actually don't listen to podcasts. But if you are, which one would you recommend to our audience?
Love podcasts. I usually listen to them while I'm out taking walks. I love to walk. I end up listening to a lot of news-oriented podcasts, The Daily, and I do listen to some on well-being and on psychology. But I will admit to getting a lot of my news through daily podcasts through, New York Times, LA Times, things like that, the sources that put out regular podcasts. So I like it as a way to get news and information. We always listen to them on long car rides, and definitely a podcast fan.
Yeah, that's good to know. I think, listening to the news through podcast is a really good way, actually, because it's easier to digest and you don't get bombarded with different sources. And if you have a source you can trust, or a podcast you can trust, that's really good as well.
They could go a little deeper too.
Yeah.
Instead of just the headlines, you can spend 30 minutes on one topic and kind of come away feeling like, okay, I think I have a better handle on what might be going on there.
Yeah, definitely. Now, I would love to know who has influenced you in life for you to obviously get to do this work. So who would be your role model?
Another good question. I think I have lots of role models. I'm really fortunate to have lots of mentors and role models in my life. One in particular stands out, and that's my grad school advisor, Dr. William Damon. He was actually the one who started research on purpose. When I started as a grad student, he was launching his very first project, so I got to be involved in the work from the beginning. But Bill Damon has studied moral and civic development of young people for a long time. And I feel like he's really, he lives that, he is just an inspiration in so many ways. He's fun, he's funny, and he's just a really good person. And so in my professional career, I call him with questions all the time, and often think, if I'm not quite sure how to handle something, how would he handle this? And try to
Yeah.
follow the lead as best I can.
Yeah, okay. That's really good to know. And finally, what is a course you've completed that really inspired you?
Yeah, this was a good one. A course, it's hard to point to one course that I've inspired that, I was lucky enough to do my graduate work at Stanford. And I have to say, Stanford is kind of a magical person for a nerd like me, because there are tons of nerds there and there's so much amazing stuff going on. I mean, every class I took was amazing. They were all with giants in the field. And I just went to so many talks, and just being around all of that intellectual activity was really amazing. So I'm not sure if that's not really a specific course, but just my entire graduate experience, I felt so fortunate to just sort of be in this milieu of intellectual excellence.
Oh, that's so good to hear that you enjoy and really took a lot from your experience in grad school. Because for me, I went to grad school, I didn't get much from it.
Oh,
So
for you to hear
but
that.
I got some things out of it, but not the educational part of it. I think the practical part I would enjoy more. But yeah, I think a good academic experience is definitely going to shape you and really help to inspire you. Because I love learning, and that's why we're all here, right? So yeah. And speaking of learning, let's learn about today's topic. So we are talking about purpose. We're talking about well-being, and enhancing our well-being through purpose. I think is definitely an interesting angle to look at purpose, because as I've said, our audience who are tuning into this episode might already be quite familiar with the concept of, you got to have purpose, a sense of purpose in life, and identifying it. A lot of books talk about this topic, but talking about the relationship between purpose and well-being, like you were saying, Viktor Frankl was one of those people that first touched on this particular topic. There's got to be a reason why there's that relationship, right? So let's first talk about well-being and define well-being so we can understand the context to this conversation. What does well-being mean to you?
Yeah. So, as someone who studies positive psychology, this is kind of a loaded question because we think a lot about what well being means, and, how to think about it, how to conceptualize it. And I think that, early on in the study of positive psychology, we thought a lot about how well being really meant well being on an individual level, just thinking about the individual being happy and satisfied with their lives. And I think that when I really think about well being, there's also kind of a moral dimension. And by that, I mean that individuals need to thrive, but they also need to kind of contribute to societal or communal well being, in order for it to truly be an example of well being. And I think that's why I love this idea of purpose, because individuals who lead a purpose of life, they benefit in so many ways. There's so much research looking at individuals with purpose report being happier, physically healthier, they live longer. I mean, there's so many benefits associated with being with leading a life of purpose. But not only that, individuals with purpose, they're motivated to give back, to contribute to the broader world in some important way. And so I feel like that's a really important when we think about well-being, to think not just about individual well-being, but also, systems and societal well-being. And purpose is one of those unique constructs that really focuses on both. And individuals' well-being is tied to the well-being of the community, and individuals are contributing to their communities, or at least to the world beyond themselves, in order to enhance the well-being of others. So
Yeah.
I hope that, yeah.
Oh, no, totally. I think it's a relationship that often gets forgotten because on the show we talk a lot about like what it means to each person, and there are different aspects like physical well-being, mental well-being and emotional well-being, and so on. But there's another aspect that is even more important, which is that piece of connection, and how we are connecting our well-being with others' well-being. And, and when we talk about today's topic, excuse me, which is the sense of purpose, it's even broader than that and bigger than that. How do we connect with this world? Like, what are we here for, truly? And that actually really helps with our well-being. So speaking of that, I wonder, and this is also because you told me you've interviewed a lot of people. So when you're doing the interview, I'm sure you have your own observation, and you interact with people in your lives as well. You might notice people might not really get that. Sometimes they misunderstand well-being in the first place. So what are some of the biggest misconceptions that people have about well-being?
Yeah. So I feel like sometimes people think about well-being as momentary happiness. And so in the field, we tend to, in the research, they tend to think about hedonic well-being versus eudaimonic well-being. And hedonic well-being is really that kind of sense of momentary happiness, right? I'm going to do the things that make me happy in the moment. They might be, if I enjoy eating lots of sweets, that makes me happy, I'm going to do that. If I want to veg out in front of the TV, that makes me happy, I'm going to do that. Those things do contribute to a hedonic sense of well-being. But then there's this idea of the hedonic treadmill, right? That after a while, these little things that bring you happiness, they get old, you get tired of them, they don't make you as happy anymore. And so then we can think about this idea of eudaimonic well-being. And eudaimonic well-being is really more aligned with the idea of purpose. And so it's more enduring sense of well-being. It's a more enduring sense of being satisfied with your life, but it comes through being a good person, through contributing to the broader world. And it turns out that we have, generally people report really positive feelings associated with giving back, with helping others, with contributing to their communities. And that sense of well-being, that eudaimonic sense of well-being, is much more enduring, much more long-lasting. And so I think it's important to think about, the things that might make you really happy in the short term contribute to this hedonic well-being, and that's not such a bad thing, but it's not lasting. It's not going to carry you through. It's this eudaimonic sense of well-being that is much more enduring. And we really find that through, like I said, through purpose and through finding the way that you want to contribute to the broader world. I think it's probably important to highlight that when we think about purpose, we think about these goals, these sort of long-term aims in your life that are really inspiring. They're really important to you. You care deeply about them. In fact, we find that people care so deeply about them that their purpose in life becomes wrapped up in their identity. How they think about who they are is really aligned with how they think about what they want to accomplish in their lives. And all of that is inspired by a desire to contribute, to give back, to leave your mark, to make some positive difference in the world beyond yourself. So in that way, purpose is really well aligned with this concept of eudaimonic well-being, which is this sort of long-term, enduring, contributory, sort of oriented form of well-being.
Yeah. Wow. I think that's interesting because we have another show about happiness, actually. And on that show, I've heard, the definitions that kind of very similar to what you're saying, but like from the context of happiness as well. And sometimes that we know there's this like big overlap between happiness and well-being, and we're kind of like, okay, so what's the overlap? But I guess when you're saying, like that feeling of, the well-being sense here, some people just think that it's kind of like this feeling, this thing that, okay, you feel good or you feel happy. It's not lasting. And I totally agree with that, because when we think about different things and activities that we do in life, it can be driven by, the feeling of, okay, I'm going to feel good right now. I'm going to feel good when I do that particular activity. But it's not really a lasting sense of a feeling of fulfillment or feeling like you have that sense of well-being. And I think a lot of people, relate with that.
Yeah. And I was going to say, I think there's this amazing quote in Frankl's book where he talks about, I can't remember the exact quote, but he talks about how if you pursue happiness directly, which is kind of that hedonic sense of well-being, you're never going to find it. However, if you pursue a larger purpose in life, you will find well-being, you will find happiness as an offshoot, right? As a byproduct, because when your life feels really significant and important, you do have this deep, abiding sense of contentment that I think is really associated with well-being.
Yeah, that's really true. And speaking of that, we are here to talk about purpose, right? And since you just mentioned purpose, perfectly there, let's talk about how we would go about looking at it. Because for a lot of people, this is nothing new. We all know about, okay, we should have a sense of purpose, but what is it really, especially from a scientific perspective, from a research perspective? I'm sure there's a way for us to really conceptualize it in a way that we can understand easily.
Yeah, I'm glad you asked. So when we think about purpose, like you said, we do studies of the way that real people think about purpose all the time. And our conception as scholars is certainly aligns with that. It's not a wholly different construct or anything. But when we're going to scientifically investigate this construct, we have to come up with a definition that is really clearly delineated and also one that can be operationalized in our studies. So the way that we think about purpose it has these three components. Number one is this sort of goal orientation. Now, again, we have lots of goals. It's not a short-term goal. It's not like, I want to find a parking spot in town today, or not that kind of goal, but a big aim for your life. What is it? What are you trying to accomplish with your life? Okay, so it's got that sort of goal-oriented component. The second component is that it's really personally meaningful, something we really care about. This is a goal that is, it matters to us. It matters so much that we are going to go out and get involved in taking action towards it, towards making progress toward it. And third is that it's this long-term aim. It's a particularly personally meaningful aim. And it's also an aim that is inspired by a desire to contribute to the broader world in some way, to give back, to have a positive impact. And I think that's really important to note, because that's how we differentiate purpose from meaning. And in our everyday conversations, we kind of use purpose and meaning interchangeably, and that's not a problem. But when you're trying to do scientific research on a construct, you can't have two constructs that mean the exact same thing. Otherwise, why would you have two constructs, right? So we think of meaning as this big, broad umbrella of all of the things that are personally significant to you. So it might mean that you find a lot of meaning in taking a walk in the woods. Purpose, alternatively, represents just a subset. So you have this broader umbrella of sources of meaning, and purpose is just a subset of those sources of meaning. Those sources of meaning that are sort of goal-oriented, that you're working towards achieving, or at least making progress toward, and that are inspired by a desire to give back to the world beyond yourself. So like I said, whereas maybe taking a walk in the woods would fill your life with meaning, working to preserve the environment might serve as a purpose for your life. So they are distinct. And I think that from a scientific perspective, that's super important.
Yeah, I think that's certainly fascinating to think about, because sometimes we probably use purpose and meaning interchangeably without knowing that they're quite different. And, when you said that purpose is kind of a subset of meaning, I'm kind of like, oh, that's interesting. How do I distinguish between the two, and how do I sort of like work on that myself for my life in a way that is not just kind of lumping them both together. They're not the exact same, right? So yeah, certainly interesting with that angle.
Yeah, it's a subtle distinction, and there's definitely points of overlap, but there are important sources or points of distinction too. And like I said, meaning can be those things that are very self-focused, whereas purpose in life, it's inspired at least in part by a desire to contribute to the broader world, or to the world beyond self in some way. So
yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. So since you've studied this at length and you've talked to a lot of people about this, how does a sense of purpose in life actually enhance well-being?
Yeah. Well, I mean, as it turns out, this is really where the research and purpose sort of got started. Because at first we thought, well, what difference does it make to even lead a life of purpose? And it turns out that purpose contributes in a broad range of ways to well-being. So I think of purpose as, well, to be honest, I think of it as both a contributor to well-being and maybe even possibly an indicator of well-being. So it's like contributes to it, but it also, we look at people who are doing well, they tend to have a purpose in life. So like I said, the research has looked at the psychological benefits associated with leading a life of purpose. We find that individuals with purpose, they're more satisfied with their lives. They're more hopeful. They're more optimistic. There are physical health benefits. People with a purpose in life sleep better. And I think if you know what it is you're trying to accomplish in your life and you feel like you're making progress toward it, you sleep soundly, which is kind of interesting. It's also associated with like social benefits. So individuals with purpose tend to have a broader and more and sort of deeper connection to other people. And for young people, it's associated with academic benefits. Young people with purpose tend to be more resilient. They tend to be kind of grittier, right? They're more willing to stick with the hard stuff. They have what we call an internal locus of control, which just means they feel they have control over what it is that they're doing at school. It's not like, these things are just happening to them, although some things maybe, but they feel as though their schoolwork, they have some element of control over their own academic success. So I feel like there's really a broad range of ways in which the empirical research suggests purpose contributes to this sense of well-being. But then, like I said from the beginning, I also think of well-being as more than just being happy and feeling good, but having this sense of purpose, having this desire to contribute to the broader world in a personally meaningful way. So I guess I think of it as both something that contributes to well-being and as an indicator of that well-being is present.
Yeah, that's a really good point, and I think that just gives us a lot of comfort in knowing that it's not like you have to chase well-being. It's actually you have to discover your purpose and discover what it is that you would like to do with your life, which actually is even harder because then people will start to face the music, right? Because it's like, oh, it's not like, if I do yoga and go to the gym today, then I'll feel good and my well-being is enhanced. Not just that, that's probably one small component of it. But beyond that, I think what we do every single day and how we show up in the world, it has to be linked with our sense of purpose. But I think for a lot of people, when they hear that, they will start to freak out, myself included, because then we'll start to wonder, so what is my purpose? It's hard to know. What am I supposed to do in this life? Like, how can I contribute? It's quite a broad thing to discover. And, there's a concept called ikigai, right? The Japanese concept. A lot of people think about that when they think about purpose. And I myself have read up on that quite a bit. And even though I have, done my own thinking about myself, it's still hard for me to figure it out. And I think in our research, we find that from a positive psychology framework, we have this character strength called perspective. And that helps people to discover their sense of purpose. And I find this to be a new caveat that I didn't sort of see before. So I'm keen to pick your brains on this topic because, perspective as a character strength. First of all, that's new to me. Even when I saw this research, I was kind of like, oh, that's interesting. And second of all, it helps you to discover your sense of purpose. How?
Well, so perspective is really the ability to see the big picture and to see how you fit into the big picture. And I think that's a necessary prerequisite to thinking about purpose. You need to think about, what's going on in the broader world and how can I contribute? And I think that there's actually been a decent amount of research looking at how can we help people lead lives of purpose. Because it turns out I went through this sort of litany of benefits associated with leading a life of purpose. But most of our research suggests that people struggle to articulate a purpose for their life. Just like you were saying, it can be a little bit intimidating. And only about 1 in 3 adults can really articulate a clear purpose for their lives. So it's kind of a tall order. And what we find is that A purpose is really more cultivated than discovered or found. And I think if you think about finding a purpose, it's like, well, I guess I'll, is it under this rock? Is it over here? Right? It's not sitting somewhere. It's within you. And so we really talk about cultivating that and pulling that out of you. And we have a variety of activities that can help you sort of do that. So one of the things that we will do, especially I should say the reason that I tend to focus on purpose among young people is that there's a really tight connection between purpose and identity development. And I sort of referenced that earlier, but young people from adolescence into the young adult years are really sort of figuring out who they are, what they care about, what they value, what they believe. And all of that is sort of identity development. But in some people, it's really tied to their purpose formation. So who they are is inextricably intertwined with what they hope to accomplish in their lives. And so this is part of the reason that a lot of my research has looked at purpose among young people. They're in the midst of this identity development stage, even until their mid to later 20s, really making decisions about which course do I want to pursue in life, and where do I, how do I see myself fitting in? And so this idea of purpose is really relevant because it's kind of right where they are. It's right where they are in terms of making the decisions for their lives. And so one of the things that we find that's just really helpful if you are trying to sort of cultivate purpose is to talk about it. And it can be a little bit intimidating. If I sit down and, ask a young person, what's your purpose in life? You'll get that deer in the headlights look. But instead, if we ask, think about what are some things that really matter to you? What do you care about? What are you trying to accomplish? What would you like to accomplish in your life? And we engage in a conversation. We know that will help the young person start to come to some conclusions. We did a study where we had administered surveys to like 1,000 young people across the US and Canada. And then we just randomly selected about 100 of them to participate in interviews. And I think you said at the beginning of our interview, young people aren't given very many opportunities to reflect on this, right? Where young people, it's like, what are you doing next week? What are you doing next year? But not what are you really doing with your life? Unless it's like, I'm graduating from college and people are like, get your act together. It seems like it pops up in a negative way instead of a positive sort of like, all these doors are open to you. Which one do you want to walk through and why kind of way? And so anyway, the idea being that if we can engage young people in these conversations, they're much more likely to develop purpose. And when we did these interviews with young people, the 100 young people, totally randomly selected, we were amazed at how many young people came back to us and said, hey, I said some good stuff in that interview. Can you share that transcript with me? Or can I get the audio recording? And we started to wonder, like, is it possible that just this interview was an intervention in and of itself? So one of my colleagues, Matt Bundick, he actually looked at the data. As it turned out, we did these surveys, randomly selected a subset to interview, and then we did the surveys again. And we found that those young people randomly selected to participate in the interview reported significantly higher rates of purpose months later in the second round of surveys. So we figured that just part of cultivating this sense of purpose is talking about it with people who can push your thinking a little bit. We've even done these activities where we'll have young adults send an email to 5 adults who know you well. These can be coaches or teachers or mentors or extended family members, and ask them to answer just 3 questions about you. And the 3 questions are, number 1, what do you think I do? What do you think I really enjoy doing? Number 2, what do you think I do particularly well? And number 3, how do you think I'll leave my mark? And if they can get these people to email them back, the responses tend to be really illuminating. It turns out that even if you don't know what your purpose in life is, sometimes the people close to you have a pretty good idea. And as they reflect back to you some of the things that they think might provide a purpose for your life, it can help advance your thinking as well. So I think instead of thinking about it as like, I just have to be on this, scavenger hunt and look here and there and see if I can figure it out, we can sort of take this approach of cultivating it, talking about it with people who know us well, And then talking about the things that we try, the different jobs or the volunteer experiences or right, whatever activities you're engaged in. Sometimes we just do it and move on to the next thing. And our research suggests that if you can engage in an activity and then step back and reflect on it, what did I like about it? What did I not like about it? What difference was I able to make? And if I wasn't able to make a difference, what do I wish I'd been able to do? And so again, engaging in conversation with people who can help us kind of think these things through. I think all of that is really core to this process of cultivating purpose over time. So it's probably not going to happen overnight. Occasionally it does. Sometimes people have, our research would suggest that sometimes people have kind of a dramatic event and it changes everything and all of a sudden they have a purpose. But for most people, it's a more gradual process. But I think if we think about it as cultivating a purpose, right, doing the things, engaging in conversation, engaging in reflection, I hope it's a little less intimidating. It's not like you're out there on your own and you have to just find it. It's more of a process of engaging in dialogue, in reflection, trying new things, and hopefully moving forward.
Yeah, definitely. I think that's a really good perspective. Speaking of perspective as a character strength. And I think one thing that might be important to note as well is I do notice, at least for me personally, that my sense of purpose evolves over time. It's not a static thing where, like you discovered it and you're kind of like, oh, I have it all figured out. That's my sense of purpose. Not entirely. It changes actually.
Yes, I think that's exactly right. Our research suggests that people often have more than one purpose in life. And research with older adults, where they're sort of looking back over their life, they often talk about how they had multiple purposes over the course of their lives. And some of these purposes kind of waxed and waned. So they might have found really deep sense of purpose in raising children. But as their children became adults and left home, the relationship changed. I mean, sure, they were still parents, but not in the way they were when they had young children at home and they were engaged in the day-to-day, right, busyness of being a parent. Same with work. Some people find purpose in the jobs that they hold, but when they retire, right, that purpose they found in working, it may wane and they may look to new sources of engagement to provide purpose for their life. So I think that's right. Your purposes can evolve. They can sort of take center stage for a while and then tail off after a while. It doesn't have to be the case that you just have one purpose and it never changes.
Yeah, that's so true. I think it's comforting for people to know as well that this is a process. It's not like a project where you just sit down and you're like, okay, within 1 month I will figure out what my purpose is. Because I think that can be, like you were saying earlier, quite intimidating. And it defeats the whole purpose of looking for what it is that you would like to do with your life. Because it's kind of like you're rushing through the process and you're just trying to put something on paper and say, okay, this is my purpose, where in fact it might not be the case. I do think that there needs to also be a strong emphasis on the fact that, this might take months, it might take years, it might evolve quite a bit. And sometimes at this very moment is quite unclear. So the discovery process is also something that can get people to be really engaged. And that helps with well-being as well, because at least you're actively participating in that part of your life when you try to understand what it is that you're here to do. So I think that helps as well.
Yep, I agree. We actually have a study underway right now where we're looking at patience in the search for purpose. So patience, as we think about it, is, again, we're looking at it from a scientific perspective. So we think about it, this staying really engaged, staying calm while staying engaged in working towards your goal. And that's what I think you need to do when you're searching for your purpose in life. You need to be patient. You need to recognize it is going to take some time. It is a process. And the interesting thing is we tend to find that even once individuals have a purpose for their life, they're always searching for more purpose in the same activities that they're doing and for other sources of purpose as well. So I think if we kind of come to grips with the fact that this search for meaning and for purpose in our lives is probably just what makes us human. And so that even if we feel like, yeah, I do know what my purpose is, it doesn't mean we're not going to also continue to look for greater purpose at the same time.
Yeah, I know this is quite off script, but once you talked about that, I'm now curious, and I kind of want to know how you discovered your sense of purpose and what it is.
Yeah. So this is a question I've given a lot of thought to. I think that I have two sort of purposes in life. I find a lot of purpose in being a parent. I have two children, and I am doing my best to help support them and help them to grow up to be good people who are concerned about others and concerned about the well-being of where they're living and finding ways to contribute and to give back. So I think being a parent gives me a lot of purpose, but I also find a lot of purpose in the work that I do. I like the idea that I'm contributing, my little piece to this scientific conversation around purpose. And I think that the research that's getting out there, people are finding ways. They're finding ways in schools to help cultivate purpose, in counseling settings, in organizational settings. And so I like the idea that I'm contributing a small piece to this larger conversation around how to help more and more people, pursue well-being and purpose in their lives. So I think both of those have been really important avenues for purpose in my own life.
Yeah, that's really great to hear. And, those are beautiful purposes. But how did you go about discovering them? I'm sure that there's got to be a process there. Like obviously you don't just wake up one day and you're like, I want to help people discover their purpose.
Right. Well, I was actually working in business, which is funny. Right out of college, I worked in management consulting. Loved it. It was a great experience. But I realized I was asking all the wrong questions. We did a lot of work in the tech space, and this was back in the late 90s. I'm old. And so I realized that I was really curious about how people were making all these moral decisions about what was right and what was wrong, because there weren't a lot of laws on the books yet. And the partner where I worked kept looking at me sideways like, who cares? Like, that's not relevant to what we're doing. So I kind of realized, I think I'm asking questions that are directing me in a different, I should be going in a different direction. So I started reading things about moral development. This is how I came across Bill Damon's work. He later became my advisor in grad school. And I realized the more I read about what he was doing, like, yes, this is where my heart was. And, it's funny because I was talking with a group of seventh graders about purpose. And I remember when I was in middle school, watching this movie, and I don't even know what the movie was, but they posed this question, and it was something like, what difference does your life make anyway? And at the time I thought, ooh, that's a big question. What difference does my life make? And I remember just kind of like mulling that over for years. And then I think it kind of disappeared. I lost track of it. But when I was in grad school and I had the opportunity to work on this project looking at purpose, I realized, like, wait a minute, this is that question that I swear I was playing with in my mind about what difference your life makes. How interesting that now I'm being given this opportunity to kind of look at it. And recently, my parents moved out. They're getting older. They moved into a smaller home. And I was going through a lot of my things in my bedroom, my journals and letters I'd written and things like that. And I was struck by how many of them reflected on this kind of question of purpose and what difference my life makes. And I realized, like, I've been thinking about this for a long time. And I was just, in grad school, given an opportunity to investigate it. So it was a process. And to be honest, it wasn't until I was sort of engaged in the work and I started looking back and I remembered this question and I went back to my childhood bedroom and was reading the things that I read that I realized, like, gosh, this has been on my mind for a while. Maybe this is sort of where I'm meant to be going. Maybe this is the way I will be able to leave behind something positive and hopefully of use to others.
Yeah, well, that's great to hear. And you're definitely on the right track there because, we get to work with you today and talk about purpose. And, I'm sure you've worked with so many others as well. And defining purpose is hard, and finding it is a process. And in a way, you're kind of enabling us and the people that you've worked with to understand it better and to find it better, because sometimes we just don't know where to look. Even the prompts, the questions that you were sharing with me earlier, I started to think about them as we were going through this conversation. I was kind of like, they are interesting. If I could ask my friends and the people closest to me about these questions, that would be very helpful, because perspectives matter. Sometimes I don't see it. They would help. Yeah.
I think that's right. And I just appreciate the opportunity to be on your podcast, because I agree. I feel like I do find a lot of purpose in having the research that I am working on being used. I mean, there's not really much reason to go around studying all of this and have it just sit on the shelf in a library somewhere if nobody's ever going to use it. So I love the opportunity to talk with people like you who can share the message with people who can hopefully put it into practice.
Yeah,
I find
definitely.
that meaningful.
Oh, beautiful. Well, thank you for doing the work that you're doing. It's great. And you mentioned practice, which is the perfect way for us to get into the practice part, because we have covered, a bit of theory here and there where we talk about well-being, purpose in life. We talked about perspective as a character strength, which is, interesting for people to start thinking about. And I think the emphasis on the fact that this is a journey is the most important aspect of it all, because it's not like a formula we can give people today that they're going to find out their purpose by the end of the day. It doesn't work like that. The purpose in life, it needs to be cultivated, like you were saying, right? It's a cultivation process. So that's the fun part of it. It's kind of like growing a plant, So let's help people to start growing their purpose plant with a practice. So what would be a practice that you personally do, or you would recommend for people to try doing to help them discover their sense of purpose?
Yeah. Well, so one practice is the email activity that I shared with you earlier. Writing emails to adults who know you well and asking them to reflect on those 3 questions. Something else that sort of surprisingly contributes to purpose is the practice of gratitude. It turns out that when we really focus on the things that we're grateful for, on the blessings in our lives, on the people who have helped us, we're kind of naturally inclined to start to think about how we can give back. So we did this study where we designed 2 interventions, one designed to cultivate purpose directly and one designed just to cultivate gratitude. And it turned out that the one that cultivated gratitude worked just as well, even slightly better than the one that worked to cultivate purpose directly. So I gave you the email activity. That's one that's more directly focused on purpose. And I thought I'd share with you a practice around gratitude that is kind of an indirect way to cultivating purpose. So there are lots of different activities that you can do that we know cultivate purpose or gratitude, excuse me. And one of my favorite ones is something we call 3 good things. It's super simple. I did this with the 7th graders that I spoke with last week. But the idea is that you ask them to think about 3 good things that happened to them during the day. And at the end of each day, you can do it around the dinner table with roommates or family at night. You can do it in a journal. But the idea is each day you write down 3 good things that happened to you that day, and either write down or spend some time talking about why you're grateful for these things. So it was so fun in the 7th grade class. The kids would share like, oh, I'm grateful that, my mom took me to the local bakery and got me this amazing cookie and it tasted so good. And I just thought that was such a nice thing for her to do. And the idea is that if you wake up each morning and you realize that today I need to kind of be alert to 3 good things that happened to me, so I have something to write about or talk about later tonight, it changes the way you go through the day, right? Instead of thinking about all the daily hassles that you encounter or all the things you have to get done, you're thinking about gratitude and how lucky you are to have people out there helping you and trying to make your life easier. And like we said, over time, if you do this, you don't even have to do it every single day. If you do it 2 or 3 days a week for a few weeks, it really cultivates a grateful mindset, where you're just in this mindset of thinking about how fortunate you are to have people who are out there helping you and blessing you in so many different ways. And people, we just have this natural inclination when you're thinking about how lucky am I to have all of these wonderful people in my life. It makes you sort of naturally inclined you to start to think about, now, how can I give back? And I think that's the way in which cultivating gratitude can actually be a means of cultivating purpose. So an indirect way towards cultivating purpose, but sometimes it's a less intimidating one. Because if I ask you, tell me what's your purpose in life, that's pretty doggone intimidating. But if I ask you instead about, what are some really good things that happened to you today? What are can you think of any person that really blessed you today? And how did that feel? And why do you think they did that? And help you to think about that. That's a lot less intimidating.
Yeah, definitely. I love that. I think it's something that has been recommended quite a few times on this particular show because it's about well-being, right? Gratitude is not a new practice to us, but today we discover a new aspect to gratitude, which is it helps us to also indirectly discover our purpose in life, which is great. I think it's such a small thing we can incorporate into our daily lives. It's not as intimidating. It actually helps with so many different things, not just purpose in life, but like other aspects of our well-being. And if anyone has been following this show, I'm sure they know what gratitude is good for. I can attest to that as well. And it's a combination of the practice that you mentioned before. So combine this with the email practice. I think it'll be a really good thing to do. And it's kind of, in a way, discovering your purpose gives you a sense of purpose, if that makes sense.
Yeah. And you're exactly right that cultivating gratitude is not only good because it's an indirect way to cultivating purpose, but it helps cement social bonds. It helps make you happier. It has all these wonderful benefits as well. And I think that it helps encourage patience in the process of figuring out your purpose. So I think there's that benefit as well.
Yeah, definitely. That's so great to hear. And this is such a great topic to talk about. I just feel like I have a sense of purpose for discovering my purpose.
There you go.
It's like, the sense of purpose right now is discovering my purpose. That's my purpose at the moment. And that's actually really fun. If anyone is kind of like, oh, I don't really know my purpose in life, maybe they can try that with me. We can all discover our sense of purpose, and that is our current purpose.
Yeah. And finding different ways of giving back can be really fun, really rewarding. Try different things, get out and volunteer, think about ways in which your job allows you to, contribute. And so just sort of bringing that mindset to everything that you're doing, I think is you're well on your way to cultivating this purpose in life.
Yeah, definitely. Well, thank you for sharing that and for the encouragement to our audience, not just some tips and some scientific insights, but also I think the encouragement to discover it. It's important because, as you mentioned earlier, there's not that many conversations about this topic, and we actually need to know more about it, and we can start working on it once we talk about it more. For example, today, by talking to you about it and interviewing you about the topic, I get a renewed sense of, let's discover or rediscover my sense of purpose in life. And I think it's such a nice reminder. So we are towards the end of the podcast. We've covered most of the things that we want to talk about when it comes to purpose and well-being. But I know you are a woman of many passions. I'm sure you have so many things you're working on. You just talked about a project that's ongoing right now, and I'm sure there are more. So here's your open mic. I'm sure you have so many things you would like to share with our audience. So it might be hard to pick one, and you could just talk about all of them if you wish. So the floor is all yours.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, well, I mean, I feel like purpose is such it's a topic that we live in our daily lives, but it is also a topic that we study from a really scientific perspective. And so I thought maybe some of your listeners would be curious to know about how we look at it from a scientific perspective and how we investigate it. And I thought as a means of doing that, I could tell you a little bit about some of the studies we currently have underway So one of the studies that we're doing right now is a longitudinal study, and that means that we're following young people. We're interviewing them every year throughout the course of high school and into college. We're coming into our third year right now. And it's been really fun. We've followed 50 young people in the US and 50 young people in Taiwan. And we're really interested in how they are making plans for careers, and how and to what extent does purpose sort of enter that equation. So as they're thinking about what kind of major they want to have, is anybody encouraging them to think about how these different majors might allow them to contribute to the broader world, right? So that's what we're looking at, and we're following them over time. We know that young people usually do develop purpose between the high school and sort of college and immediately beyond college kinds of years. So this is a fun opportunity to see if we can catch it in progress. So that's really interesting. It's a longitudinal study and it's cross-cultural. We're looking at what's going on in the East and the West. And so that's been a fun one. Something else we're looking at is the search for purpose and the role of patience, which I talked about a little bit earlier. That's been really interesting. We're trying to figure out, how do young people navigate? And I say young people, these are maybe 18 to 30 years of age. How do they sort of navigate the search for purpose, and how do they remain engaged towards figuring out what their purpose is? So I like hearing what you have to say, and what works and what doesn't work, in hopes of being able to share that information more widely. And then we also have a project in Africa. We've been doing some work in Liberia, and this has been, we're really trying to understand what positive youth development and purpose, to a lesser degree, what they look like in an African context. A lot of the research on purpose has taken place in the West. So a lot of it has been in these more westernized cultures. And we know that culture shapes an individual's purpose in life and even their path to thriving and well-being in significant ways. So we're trying to understand what might it look like in Liberia in particular, which has been really exciting. So a lot of my work looks at purpose among really diverse groups of young people. And so we've looked at young people in low socioeconomic backgrounds here in Los Angeles, young people in Europe in the midst of political and social change, young people in African and Asian contexts. And I just love it. I find it really inspiring. And purpose definitely looks different in all of these different contexts, but there's a thread of continuity too.
Wow, everything is interrelated. It's so interesting to hear about these projects, and I cannot wait to find out about the outcomes of the research. I think it's a good time to discover your sense of purpose, because there's so much research being done in this area. So thank you again for being here with us today and for sharing your insights. It's been a really fun conversation. First and foremost, it's really fun to talk about purpose in a not intimidating sense, not in the sense that, you have to discover it, but discover it. It will be good for you. So that sense of encouragement is really important. And thank you for sharing that with our audience. If our audience would like to find out more about your work and all those projects that you just mentioned, where should they go?
We have a pretty comprehensive website for our adolescent moral development lab. And the address is just my name. So kendallcottonbronk.com, all one word, no spaces. I don't love that URL because I really think of it as the website for our entire lab. And I have some amazing grad students without whom I absolutely could not do this work. But the organization that put the site together for us chose the URL. So you can also just Google Adolescent Moral Development Lab, and that will take you to the same spot.
Yeah, awesome. Well, thank you so much for sharing, and thanks again for being here.
Thank you so much for having me. And again, thanks for the opportunity to share some of my research, hopefully with your listeners who might be able to find some use in it. So I wish you well, and I wish you a life of purpose.
You have been listening to Doing Well, the Wellbeing Science Insights podcast produced by the Wellbeing Science Labs, a division of LMSL, the Life Management Science Labs. More episodes are available from 10 life management perspectives and can be found by searching LMSL on Apple Podcast, Google Podcast, Spotify, YouTube, and other podcasting apps available on your devices. If you enjoyed this episode, please rate, share, and subscribe to our channel so that other people can find it and we can continue to provide quality content. More of our work can be found on our website, we.lmsl.net, where you can join our movement. I'm Lu Ngo. Thanks for tuning in.